In a marble-walled chamber deep within the Riyadh palace, the lights were dimmed, but tension lit every corner. Ibrahim Traoré sat across from Mohammed bin Salman, their eyes locked, their guards silent. The air buzzed with something far weightier than diplomacy. This wasn't just a meeting, it was history sharpening its edges. Gold, MBS said, his voice even but cold. You have it, we need it. Traoré leaned forward. And what do you offer in return? Oil. Energy for your people, power for your grid, influence in global markets, MBS replied, flicking his fingers like he was tossing coins. But Traoré didn't blink. And sovereignty? MBS hesitated for half a second. That is negotiable. That was the moment the tension cracked. Traoré's smile was thin, controlled, but fire flickered in his eyes. Africa isn't for sale, he said. But we'll trade, with equals. 12 hours earlier, Traoré had landed in Riyadh under heavy secrecy. No press, no fanfare, just an armored convoy from the tarmac to the palace. His advisors warned him, Saudi interests weren't purely economic. But Traoré came prepared, not to beg, not to bend, to deal, or to walk away. The world didn't know this yet, but this meeting was about to redefine the global south, not just in trade, but in alliances. In defiance. In dignity. MBS, unfazed, tapped a dossier. Inside, maps, contracts, oil routes, profit projections. The prince offered partnership, but under the kingdom's terms. Together, he said, we control the future. Traoré closed the folder. Together, he echoed, but not under your flag. For years, Africa had been the bargaining chip. Today, it had a seat at the table, and a fist on it. The guards shifted, the translators froze. And the world kept spinning, unaware that two leaders, one with gold, the other with oil, were drawing a new border on the geopolitical map. Outside the palace walls, Riyadh shimmered under desert heat. But inside, the room turned colder as Traoré flipped through the final page of MBS's offer. How many African leaders have signed deals like this? He asked, his voice calm, his meaning sharp. MBS gave a small shrug. Enough to fuel your continent. Enough to silence others. Traoré's stare hardened. No. Enough to enslave us. The words cut deep. For decades, so-called partnerships had robbed Africa under the guise of diplomacy. Western oil giants had drained rivers and funded coups. Now, the East had learned the playbook too. Traoré wasn't here for applause. He was here to break the pattern. I know what you're afraid of, MBS said. You think we'll use your gold the way France used your resources, the way America used your skies for its drones. But we're not them. No, Traoré said, standing slowly. You're worse. Because you hide your chains in silk. The room fell into silence. No one moved. Traoré walked to the window overlooking Riyadh's skyline. We've traded gold for bullets. Uranium for war. But not anymore. If this deal moves forward, it will not be oil for silence. MBS stood too, less composed now. You came for power. I came for peace, Traoré snapped. But not peace with shackles. Back in Ouagadougou, protests still echoed in the streets. Traoré knew his people demanded dignity, not just electricity. They wanted more than infrastructure. They wanted independence, true and unbending. He turned back to MBS. You think I'm another general looking for favor, but I didn't rise to power to be polite. From the shadows, a Saudi advisor whispered, he's like Nasser. No, said another, he's hungrier. And just like that, the facade of cordial diplomacy cracked. Not because of shouting, but because truth had finally been spoken aloud. Hours passed. The negotiations moved to a private annex, a smaller, darker room where whispers held more weight than headlines. On the table now, a redrawn contract, stripped of Saudi veto rights, stripped of clauses that bound Traoré's hand. It was leaner, fairer, but still dangerous. You're bold, MBS said, watching as Traoré edited a paragraph with his pen, crossing out a section on security cooperation. But bold men get replaced. Traoré didn't look up, not when their people are awake. The Saudi delegation flinched. They weren't used to leaders rewriting terms mid-talk. Most nodded. Traoré wrote. One of MBS's generals leaned forward. You speak of equality, but you still need fuel. Without our oil, your cities will stall. Traoré's reply came sharp, and without our gold, your pipelines will rust. Without Africa's support, your global vote collapses. You think we need you more, but history is shifting. That phrase, history is shifting, hung in the room like a storm cloud. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. Back in Burkina Faso, solar grids powered by Traoré's initiatives were slowly replacing foreign dependency. Not overnight, but visibly. And in the streets, children chanted his name not because he gave speeches, but because he gave them light. Real light. MBS paced now, more agitated. You want this deal on your terms? No, Traoré said, rising. I want it on honest terms. There's a difference. The tension broke only when a call came through, an advisor from Niger. The rebels had just seized another French outpost. The old empire was crumbling faster than anyone expected. Traoré didn't smile, but his silence was loud. He turned back to MBS. The world is dividing. You can choose where you stand. With vultures circling the corpse of colonialism, or with those who are burying it. And for the first time, MBS hesitated, because in Traoré's voice, he didn't hear rebellion. He heard a rising continent. The next morning, the world woke up to a headline that hadn't been scripted. Africa and Arabia near historic accord, but Traoré walks away from control. Western news outlets were baffled. Wasn't Traoré there to secure oil? Wasn't he desperate for foreign infrastructure? But they missed the truth. He hadn't come to beg. He came to bargain, and on his own terms. Inside the royal compound, MBS sat with his advisors in silence. No one dared speak. Traoré's absence from the scheduled signing ceremony was a direct challenge, and a public one. Cameras were in place, flags were set. But the man at the center of it all had walked into the desert instead, accompanied only by a single Burkinabe guard. Why? Because the deal could not be sealed in marble halls. It had to be grounded, literally. Hours later, MBS found him in the outskirts of Riyadh, standing in the dust. What are you doing here? He asked. Traoré picked up a handful of sand and let it fall through his fingers. This land has oil, he said. Mine has gold. Yet neither of us controls the market. The West does. So why are we still playing their game? MBS stared, unsure whether to be insulted or intrigued. I'm not looking for pipelines, Traoré continued. I'm looking for leverage. You want to fuel the East? Fine. But I want refineries in Ouagadougou, jobs for our youth. A real transfer of power, not just barrels for bricks. A moment of silence passed. The sun burned above them, but neither man flinched. This isn't about friendship, Traoré added. It's about fairness. You're used to shaking hands with ghosts, leaders who sell their people for a seat at a banquet. I'm not them. MBS crossed his arms. And if I refuse? Traoré smiled faintly. Then you'll still get your oil deals. But not with Africa's soul attached. Back in Burkina Faso, the people waited, not for charity, but for justice. And Traoré knew, if he compromised now, they'd lose everything they had fought for. Because gold in the ground meant nothing, if you traded it for chains. In a private chamber lit by lanterns and tension, Traoré unfurled a map, one hand crafted by Burkinabe strategists, not borrowed from Western intelligence. It showed something MBS had never seen, a vision of Africa mapped by African hands. Trade corridors no longer snaked toward European ports. Instead, they linked Kinshasa to Khartoum, Lagos to Luanda, Ouagadougou to Riyadh. And not with arrows of extraction, but lines of reciprocity. It was a future no colonizer could profit from, only build with, or be excluded from. You redrew the world, MBS whispered, eyes narrowed. No, Traoré replied, tapping the border between Sudan and Egypt. We're just correcting it. One of the Saudi ministers scoffed. You think ink on a map changes power? Traoré leaned forward. No. But the will to redraw it does. That will had already begun to spread. Across Africa, new leaders were rising, some elected, some revolutionary, all echoing the same rhythm: dignity first, debt later. Niger had nationalized its uranium. Mali had seized control of its transit hubs. And Burkina Faso? It was lighting villages without IMF permission. MBS studied the map again. He wasn't blind to its promise, nor its threat. "You're proposing an alliance," he said slowly, "but you don't trust us." Traoré didn't flinch. Trust isn't given. It's earned. And it starts by building where the West only extracted. We don't need gifts. We need factories, satellites, railways. Real things. He then handed MBS a single page, a revised memorandum. No backdoor clauses. No military bases. Just gold for oil. Power for peace. And a seat at a shared table. It wasn't diplomacy. It was defiance written in ink. And in that moment, MBS saw something rare, not desperation, but strategy. Not rivalry, but redefinition. "You're not building a partnership," he said. "No," Traoré replied. "We're building a new world." As the memorandum circulated behind closed palace doors, the world beyond them began to shake, not from war, but from rumor. Western diplomats in Riyadh were suddenly on edge. Calls buzzed between Paris, Washington, and London. The question was the same: is MBS really signing with Traoré? Because this wasn't just a trade agreement. This was a threat to the order. A single document, signed in defiance of global financial institutions, without the oversight of the IMF, the World Bank, or any G7 ambassador, was an act of rebellion. And rebellions echo. In France, think tanks panicked. In the US, news anchors stumbled over Traoré's name. They had spent months dismissing him as a temporary populist, a regional strongman. But now he stood poised to reshape supply chains they had dominated for decades. Inside the royal compound, MBS faced a choice: follow the script written by his allies, or step into a new role, one that could make him the bridge between the rising global south and the fossilized north. "You're asking me to gamble," he said. Traoré shook his head. "No. I'm asking you to invest, in history, not just oil." There was silence, and then MBS asked something no one expected. "If I sign this, what happens next?" Traoré didn't blink. "Next," he said, "we light up Africa without waiting for permission." "And what if they come for you?" MBS pressed. "What if they destabilize you like they've done to others?" Traoré smiled, almost amused. "They already tried. Sanctions. Coups. Lies. I'm still here." Then he leaned forward. "And I've learned something," he whispered. "The empire doesn't fear armies. It fears examples." MBS exhaled. That was the truth. And it tasted like risk. But also revolution. Under the dome of the royal palace, the chandeliers above them flickered, not from electrical faults, but from the tension in the air. Cameras were banned. Phones confiscated. What was about to happen couldn't be live-streamed. Not yet. Two men stood before a document. On one side, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier president who had turned down U.S. military aid, French advisors, and Chinese silence. On the other, Mohammed bin Salman, the Prince of Oil, the architect of Vision 2030, the man who'd learned the West only loved him when he obeyed. The memorandum lay between them like a fuse. Gold for oil. Power for peace. MBS held the pen. An aide whispered, "Think carefully. This will rewrite alliances." MBS didn't respond. He signed. Slowly. Deliberately. With the same hand that once wrote defense deals with Lockheed and hosted Jared Kushner at midnight meetings. When Traoré's pen followed, it was more than a signature. It was a rupture. Across the world, seismic ripples moved beneath diplomatic buildings. The U.S. State Department issued a bland statement, monitoring developments. France called it an unfortunate deviation. The IMF paused a loan review to Riyadh. But in Bamako, children danced. In Niamey, street artists painted murals of gold and oil becoming light. And in Gaza, a candlelit vigil burned with hope, because they too had heard that the rules were changing. In the press room, a single phrase dominated headlines. Africa and Arabia no longer ask permission. One Saudi general looked uneasy. This makes us a target. Traoré turned to him. No, he said calmly. It makes us a precedent. The signatures were barely dry when the backlash began. Within hours, Washington imposed targeted sanctions, not on Traoré or MBS directly, but on the logistics firms, tanker routes, and fintech platforms that would process the new gold for oil transactions. It was the empire's way: never confront the rebellion head-on, just choke the supply lines and call it policy. In Brussels, bureaucrats scrambled to draft statements warning of economic instability and non-compliant trade frameworks. Translation: you didn't ask us first. But Traoré had expected this. From Ouagadougou, he activated a contingency plan, a network of decentralized African banks, coded in blockchain, supported by Gulf liquidity. This wasn't just about currency independence, it was about narrative independence. And for the first time, Africa wasn't isolated. Thanks to MBS, the Arab financial bloc had his back. Meanwhile, Western media went into overdrive. Fox News asked, "Is Traoré destabilizing global peace?" The BBC called him reckless. Bloomberg warned of petrochaos. But in every accusation, there was a buried confession. They were afraid. Because this wasn't a man with a megaphone. This was a man with momentum. Behind closed doors, MBS faced heat. "They'll cut us off," warned a senior advisor. "Swift access. Trade routes. Airspace." MBS replied without blinking. "Let them. They'll call you a traitor to the West," the advisor added. The Crown Prince looked out the palace window and muttered. "Then let the West learn, loyalty is not obedience." At that moment, Traoré sent a message, encrypted and brief. "Storms don't scare trees with deep roots." And MBS smiled. The world was no longer spinning on the old axis. The retaliation didn't come with missiles. It came with memos. At Langley, the CIA circulated an internal briefing: unstable alliances in the Sahel Gulf corridor. In London, the Foreign Office authorized covert funding for media outlets critical of both MBS and Traoré. In Tel Aviv, a senior strategist whispered, "If Africa and Arabia stand together, the board changes." And so the silent war began. Within days, African opposition figures, long quiet, suddenly found airtime on international channels. They called Traoré a military populist, a demagogue, an obstacle to peace. But their voices echoed hollow at home. The streets weren't listening. Because the people had seen something money couldn't buy: dignity. In Riyadh, MBS faced new pressures. A shipment of components for Vision 2030 infrastructure was mysteriously delayed by an American ally. A cybersecurity breach targeted his oil logistics chain. Threats without fingerprints. And yet, neither he nor Traoré blinked. Instead, they doubled down. Traoré flew to Algiers, securing a tri-nation trade corridor. MBS extended oil credits to Sudan and Mali. They weren't just forming a partnership, they were building a bloc. And as the world scrambled to respond, a quote from a recent Traoré speech began trending across African media. "When the empire whispers, comply, we will answer, unchain." That same day, an anonymous U.S. official leaked to Politico. Traoré isn't just defiant. He's contagious. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré watched the news in silence. He turned to his aide and said, "Let them panic. It means we're doing it right." Weeks passed. The Gulf Africa Trade Pact was no longer a headline, it was a movement. Ships bearing the new insignia, a lion and falcon intertwined, began docking in ports from Dakar to Djibouti. Refineries in Saudi Arabia processed oil specifically for African states. In return, Africa's gold flowed, not into Swiss vaults, but into Pan-African reserve banks, anchoring a new currency pilot, the Sahel dinar. The West called it economic fragmentation. Traoré called it freedom in numbers. At the African Continental Summit, held in Addis Ababa under heavy security, Traoré stepped onto the stage with MBS at his side. Cameras clicked. Western diplomats watched from the back row, stone-faced. And then Traoré spoke. "We are not your backyards. We are not your charity cases. We are not your mining fields. We are the future's architects. And today, we redraw the map. Not with weapons. But with will." Thunderous applause erupted. MBS leaned toward him and whispered, "History will remember this moment." Traoré answered with a smirk. "Only if we keep building tomorrow louder than they sell yesterday." Meanwhile, in Washington, a new op-ed appeared in Foreign Affairs. "Africa's defiance is the new global fault line." And deep in Tel Aviv, an Israeli strategist muttered over satellite photos, "We've lost the narrative." Because for the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't waiting to be saved. It was setting the terms. And at the heart of it stood two unlikely allies. A Burkinabe soldier and a Saudi prince. Proving that gold and oil could buy more than wealth. It could ignite dignity. It could fund peace. It could bury the empire.